So hello from isolation in London, where I'm starting to get a little bit of a sense of how Maria and Mrs. Norris might have felt faced with retirement slash exile at the end of Mansfield Park. So this is the week 1 roundup. My name's Kim Simpson. Thank you very much for all your comments this week and for the really kind of lively discussions that have been going on. I've really found them a welcome relief from what you can probably hear is quite a vicious cold. So apologies that I sound a bit like an elephant trying to talk at the moment. So I thought maybe it would be worth starting this kind of roundup by thinking a little bit about this use of Austen as an escape. I think many of us are here on this online forum to seek solace in what is becoming an increasingly difficult kind of time. And this is not a new phenomenon. Austen, as many of you probably know, has been kind of cherished during times of stress and particularly during times of war, actually. So we see a kind of resurgence of interest in her fiction, both after the First World War and the Second World War as well. And I guess it's worth kind of considering what this world that we're escaping into when we're reading Austen, when we're talking about Austen, is really kind of made up of. So what does Austen's past look like to us, and is that different from the actual past that she would have experienced? And it kind of leads into this wider question, which I hope we'll kind of go on to consider over the next couple of weeks, which is how much Austen is engaging with her own specific historical and political context. It's a question that some of you have already been asking this week, and I hope that we'll come on and answer in the next couple of weeks. And I think, it also begs the question of how much is going on underneath the sort of calm surface of her novels. And we often think of her novels as these kind of genteel, polite worlds. But actually, I wonder what the kind of undercurrent is there. So to give you a kind of example of what I'm talking about, we could think about the kind of the ball, the Regency ball, as a kind of genteel event. But underneath the surface, there's this kind of really careful structure of conduct and behaviour. And this structure is kind of supported and held in place by the threat of social disgrace or ostracism. I think this becomes really clear in something like Frances Burney's Evelina. So there's a scene in which the title character goes to a ball and she's completely ignorant of these sorts of behavioural rules, I guess. So she refuses one man for a dance and then subsequently dances with another. And this is a real kind of no-go at the time. And her innocence, her naive mistake, is a kind of source for comedy for Frances Burney, the writer. But there is still the kind of threat of violence underneath this, I think, the threat of sort of social disgrace. And I think it makes an interesting comparison with Austen too. What is it that's kind of underpinning this kind of polite, ordered world? So as I've been kind of engaging with you all in the kind of comments, foremost in my mind this week, and kind of unavoidably so, has been this question of health. I think we're never more aware of our own bodies when we don't feel too great. And I've been sort of thinking about Austen and health. So the recent adaptation of Sanditon sort of made me return to the text, actually. And it's surprising, how much discussion of health I think is there in Austen, in her, in Sanditon, the kind of hypochondriac characters, in the kind of structuring of an entire society around the production of health, by which I mean kind of seaside resorts. One way of kind of thinking about this topic is reflected in those comparisons that some of you have been making this week between Austen and the Brontes. And I think Austen and the Brontes are kind of united by I guess, what you'd call kind of myth making. So we have very specific conceptions that we bring to our readings of both of these authors. And they're conceptions that aren't necessarily kind of based in reality. So, we often think of Charlotte Bronte as this kind of wild woman, sort of secluded in the Yorkshire moors. We tend to kind of conflate Charlotte with her sister Emily, and to overlook Anne Bronte altogether. And I think, this overlooks the fact that, Charlotte went off travelling in Europe, well, not travelling, but working as a governess in Europe. Likewise with Austen, we think of her as neat, tidy, secluded, provincial, and perhaps that to some extent overlooks, the experience that she would have had visiting her brother in London. So what I'm getting at with this is that I think both women have kind of myths around them and ideas that audiences bring to their readings of these women. I think you've been looking at what Charlotte Bronte had to say about Jane Austen. Some of you were kind of unsurprised by that. And there are these kind of distinctions between the two women. So Bronte says, there's nothing that throbs in Austen. Austen is indeed different. There are no kind of large romantic passions, but I think we do find interest in bodies, in health. So I'm thinking about Elizabeth Bennet's healthy glow after walking through the fields, and how Darcy actually finds this really attractive. Good health, I think, becomes really apparent here. One of the other kind of connections that's been made on the boards between Austen and Bronte is this connection to do with owning their authorship. So as many of you know, Charlotte Bronte published under a pseudonym, Currer Bell, a sort of male or perhaps androgynous pseudonym. And this served a kind of protective function. On the one hand, it's aimed to protect her novels from criticisms of coarseness, although it didn't actually kind of do that, and they were criticised on those terms. But also it fulfilled or enabled her to get published in the first place. She wrote a letter to Southey, the poet laureate, who basically wrote back and said, publishing is not the business of a woman's life. And of course, fortunately for us, she ignored that advice. But her pseudonym enabled her access to a kind of restricted literary marketplace. Austen was writing in a somewhat different moment. So I think there's this kind of pervasive, lasting idea that in which we kind of map a Victorian marketplace onto an earlier one, and imagine that women couldn't write, really, and that Austen was exceptional in that she did. And this isn't actually really the case. So a lot of Austen's contemporaries are publishing under their own names, and a lot of them enjoy really good reputations amongst their male contemporaries. So I'm thinking of someone like Anne Radcliffe, for example. Austen sort of playfully satirises Radcliffe in Northanger Abbey, but Radcliffe was really well thought of by people like Walter Scott and Coleridge. Earlier women writers, Eliza Hayward is a writer that I work on, they really understood how to kind of market and advertise their writing. So they made use of their names as kind of brands, I guess, if we want to put a modern word to it. Austen herself did a similar thing. She publishes, first of all, by a lady, but then by the author of Sense and Sensibility, by the author of Pride and Prejudice. So she's grouping together her novels for people who've enjoyed previous ones. So she wasn't forced to publish anonymously, but I think she was very aware of reputation. She didn't want to be lauded and in the spotlight. I mean, you could be lauded and in the spotlight as a woman writer, but doing so, you kind of run risks, I suppose, of that backfiring. And Austen, I think, wanted to stay away from that kind of reputational danger in publishing. In fact, the only time that her name does appear is in a subscription list to Frances Burney's Camilla. So that's all I'll say on that. I think there were some other really interesting comments on kind of genre, I guess. So thinking about what Austen thought about Mary Brunton, the discussion there was great, actually. And I think a lot of you have kind of correctly identified that division between realist fiction on the one hand and something that's kind of more kind of fantastic, that's based around sort of improbable events, what we might call romance. And this idea kind of taps into a kind of long-standing, although now rather complicated, view of literary history, which sees the novel form kind of rising out of romance and towards realism. Of course, this is not a linear process at all, and we can see elements of kind of romance in Austen's fiction, as well as kind of realist elements, which she's kind of pioneering in some ways. One of the other kind of areas that I thought was really interesting was the discussion about manuscript destruction. I was fortunate enough to go to a talk a couple of weeks ago where Catherine Sutherland, who's written a lot about Jane Austen's manuscripts, talked about other writers' drafting practices. So a lot of writers would leave space around the margins of what they were doing so that they could edit. Or they would edit in notebooks with the kind of opposite page left free for annotations and subsequent edits. Austen, from the existing bit of persuasion that we still have from her Juvenilia, didn't leave this space for herself, and so there's a kind of sense that her writing is a very kind of precise act. It's all kind of packed into pages. It's not kind of massively edited. Perhaps this means that there were kind of prior versions. Perhaps not, but I think it certainly kind of elucidates that quotation that we have from Austen, where she talks about her work as or her writing as the little bit 2 inches wide of ivory on which I work with so fine a brush. So I think there's really interesting things to be gleaned from looking at the kind of existing bits of Austen's writing in manuscript that we still have. Just in closing then, a couple of people asked direct questions in the reflection bit, and I wanted to respond to some of those. So the first one is about other classes. Did Austen speak with people from other classes? And I'm going to just specifically think about kind of working classes. To some extent, yes. So she would have had dealings with her own servants, and she would have also been involved in kind of helping the poor, which would have been a part of her female duties, particularly as the daughter of a clergyman. But as many of you have pointed out, her books are very much concerned with middle and upper class characters. For those of you interested in kind of modern historical adaptations, Jo Baker's Longbourn reimagines Pride and Prejudice from the perspective of the servants, and is a really an interesting read. I think Austen also enjoyed a friendship with a woman called Anne Sharp, who was Fanny Knight's governess at Godmersham, and they had a kind of lasting correspondence even after Anne left Godmersham. So I think, although that said, the governess position itself is necessarily quite complicated. Another question was about whether or not Austen discussed her plots and her writing with anyone. Again, this is kind of uncertain. She was certainly very interested in opinions of her novels. So she collected and kind of wrote out opinions of Mansfield Park and Emma. And presumably she would have read sections as she was writing to her immediate family as well. But no manuscripts and the destruction of many of her letters means that our knowledge of her creative practices is necessarily quite limited. However, I think we've got the Juvenilia, and we can see that she collaborated with Cassandra. These were very much kind of written for the family, and so this suggests that she did seek guidance, and that her writing practices, particularly in her earlier years, were kind of informed by other kind of family members, perhaps. One participant asked about her political leanings and her opinions on international affairs. And as I said earlier, I think we're going to kind of come on and speak about that going forward. But I suppose one place to start would be Marilyn Butler's Jane Austen and the War of Ideas, which kind of makes the argument that Jane Austen is a very conservative writer. it's an argument that's been disagreed with, and the debate kind of still goes on. So many of you will have seen Helena Kelly's recent book, Jane Austen, The Secret Radical, which makes a complete opposite argument. So I think, the jury is out on this, and it's something I hope we can pick up going forward. And then the last kind of question, and something that I think many of you are very interested in, is Jane Austen's personal life. You want to get a kind of sense of who she was as a person, and what her day-to-day life might have looked like. Next week we'll be thinking about influences and biography, so I hope that will give you more of an insight into this, and answer some of your questions. But in the meantime, I can really recommend Jane Tomerlin's biography of Jane Austen, which is Claire Tomerlin's biography of Jane Austen, and also Deirdre LeFay's collection of her letters as well. Although Cassandra has destroyed them, and some of them, and therefore we get a kind of carefully curated version of Jane Austen through these letters, I still think they provide really interesting insights into the kind of daily life of her and her family. Okay, so I'm going to draw it to a close there. I hope that you are all well, in good health, and kind of keeping sane during this period. It's a real pleasure to be able to share conversations with you all, so I do hope you'll kind of carry on contributing, and I hope that this horrible coronavirus may be thoroughly seen off by what one participant called besotted with Jane virus, and made me laugh out loud. So good health to you all, and I will see you again soon.